It's midnight at writer Bob Gale's house. The year is 1986. He's sitting at his word processor typing up the sequel to Back to the Future while director Robert Zemeckis is out of town filming Who Framed Roger Rabbit. The first Back to the Future film was a gigantic hit in 1985, and very recently, it had been released on videotape. It was there that home viewers would see an added bonus at the end of the movie, the words, "To be continued." This was a sly way of informing the audience that a sequel was indeed on the way. But little did anyone know that things were taking a chaotic turn behind the scenes. Some key members of the cast from the first film were starting to be erased from existence, and it would change the destiny of the sequel for better or worse. So sit back, relax, grab a hydrated pizza, and let's go back to the future, Part 2. Before we get into the video, don't forget to insert some plutonium into the like button and hit the subscribe button near the time circuits. If you do, it'll send my DeLorean into the future and we can bet on some sports statistics. And now, back to the show. So there Bob Gale is, writing his latest draft of Back to the Future Part 2, for now simply titled Number 2. And it really was starting to feel like Number 2 at this point. In an unused early draft of the script, Gale found himself killing off and pushing to the side a beloved character from the first film, George McFly. When Doc and Marty go to the year 2015, George is already dead. When we end up in an alternate 1985, he is also dead. Another time jump to the 1960s finds George out of town on a teaching assignment. What the heck is going on here? Well, before Gale was tasked with making the first draft of the sequel, he and Zemeckis had asked various cast members if they would be down to return for the film. Michael J. Fox, good to go. Christopher Lloyd, bring it on. Leah Thompson and Tom Wilson, name the date, they'll be there. Crispin Glover, not so fast. It may look like a flawless performance, but in the first film, getting Glover's final character traits onto the screen was more difficult. I touched on this in my first video, The Chaotic Past of Back to the Future, but to sum it up quickly, Crispin was sometimes hard to work with. He would do things like cut his hair the night before his first day of filming, to which the production had no choice but to accept it. Famously, Crispin also voiced his distaste for how the McFlys were now wealthy at the end of the movie. He expressed that it was a bad message that made it seem like Lorraine and George's happiness is the result of being rich. Personally, I always thought they seemed very in love at the end of the movie, and I always equated their success with being an offshoot of that love. Not only that, George made money by following his dream of becoming a writer. Sounds like a good message to me. Crispin would always move in and out of frame, for instance, during the scene in the cafeteria where Marty tries to convince him to ask Lorraine to the dance. After a while of trying to get what he needed, and failing, Robert Zemeckis asked producer Neil Canton to help with the situation. Canton would try to explain that moving in and out of frame and messing his hair up from take to take would make the editing process a nightmare for post-production. After Glover stayed steadfast in his interpretation of the scene, Canton then threatened to duct tape Crispin to his seat to get the take they needed. For added effect, he asked the gaffer how much duct tape they had, to which the gaffer replied, "Plenty." On the very next take, it was exactly what Zemeckis needed. Robert Zemeckis said, on working with Glover, there are certain disciplines you have to have when you're making a movie, and he just didn't understand that. I was as patient as I could possibly be, except that at some point, your patience runs out and you just have to get the movie made. So when it came time to asking if Crispin was down to return for the sequel, Bob Gale was understandably hesitant due to the difficult nature of the actor's working style last time. According to Crispin, he was being offered less than half of what Leah Thompson and Tom Wilson were being paid. It's been said that Glover was asking for the same pay as Michael J. Fox and that he also had a list of demands to go with it. Gale responded to Glover's agents and told them to bring him a more reasonable offer. He gave them 2 weeks, after which Glover's agents said that their client would not budge. Now you see why Bob Gale was doing his best to weave George McFly out of the sequel, at least physically. However, Zemeckis and Gale ended up agreeing that having George be dead in 2 out of the 3 timelines, as well as absent in the other, was depressing. So that was changed in the drafts that followed. Later on, closer to production, Glover would become interested in joining the sequel once again. Robert Zemeckis even took him on a tour of the sets being built, as well as talked him through the story beats, and it seemed as if Glover was responding positively. Bob Gale's new offer to Crispin and his agents was double what he had been paid on the first movie. He also offered an additional fee to play the bonus role of Seamus McFly, who would show up in the third movie. Unfortunately, Crispin fired his agents and hired new ones who asked for more money. This ended with Gale informing them that they were on a fixed budget at this point and that they needed to take the offer or leave it. Well, they ended up leaving it, and George McFly would have to be recast. But Crispin Glover wasn't the only actor to be recast in Back to the Future 2. Claudia Wells would also not be returning for the sequel. Her mother was diagnosed with cancer and she would be taking an extended hiatus from acting. Some of the candidates that were considered were Julie Warner, who starred in Doc Hollywood with Michael J. Fox later on in 1990, and Lori Loughlin, who went on to star in Full House. Ultimately, Elizabeth Shue was chosen to replace Wells after auditioning at Universal Studios Stage 14. Meanwhile, an actor named Jeffrey Weissman was auditioning for what he thought was a stand-in photo double for the role of George McFly. After making it through a sequence of casting sessions, Weissman was informed that he had the job, at which point he would start getting fitted with molds from Crispin Glover's face. Robert Zemeckis asked cinematographer Dean Cundey what he thought, and Cundey responded, "I think we got Crispin without the trouble." At this point in time, there was actually no precedent for using someone else's likeness in a movie without consent. Looking back at it now, it seems weird. I mean, think about how Jeffrey Weissman must have felt. He was literally wearing Crispin Glover's face. In fact, Leah Thompson referred to him as the imposter dude, according to an interview with the YouTube channel Pop Goes the Culture. This and many other incidents, like crew calling him Crispin, led the actor to feel very awkward in the role. When telling the story behind all of this at the New Jersey Horror Con, Weissman informed the crowd that his wife had been pregnant at the time and he needed to take the job, which he was being paid SAG minimum for. It obviously wasn't easy or glamorous doing what Weissman had to do for the role. Even putting him upside down in the medical hovering device from the movie was meant specifically for Crispin Glover, had he returned to the role. It was perceived as a bit of revenge for all the trouble he had caused on the first movie. Well, Crispin ended up suing the studio for having taken his likeness without his consent. The studio settled out of court for the sum of $760,000. It also led to the Screen Actors Guild changing the rules for this type of incident going forward. To this day, Bob Gale and Crispin Glover have bad blood about it. Back to the Future Part 2 went on to gross $118 million at the domestic box office, which made it a hit in 1989, although it was only the 6th highest grossing movie that year, behind Batman, Indiana Jones 3, Lethal Weapon 2, Look Who's Talking, and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. It also brought in much less than the first movie, which made $210 million at the domestic box office in 1985. Obviously, some enthusiasm had waned since the first movie's release. One reason attributed to this was that audiences weren't aware that the sequel was one of 2 parts. At the end of the movie, it ends on a cliffhanger with the words, "To be concluded," slapped across the screen. This annoyed people at the time, and word of mouth hurt the second weekend of release, which had a steep decline in audience turnout. Robert Zemeckis later admitted that he didn't have enough time in the day to be working on 2 movies at the same time and to give it all his attention. For example, while Back to the Future 2 was undergoing its sound mix, Zemeckis was filming Back to the Future 3 in Sonora, California. He would film during the day, and at night he would fly on a private plane back to Burbank, where he would eat dinner while reviewing the edits for Part 2. He would then go to sleep at the Sheraton Universal Hotel, and then be back on a plane by 5 a.m. the next morning to fly back to Sonora, where he resumed filming on Back to the Future 3 once again. Wow, yeah, that would get exhausting. So what happened to Crispin Glover after the dust from the Back to the Future franchise settled? Well, when doing my research, I stumbled on an old David Letterman interview he did in 1987, where he entered the stage wearing a wig, bell-bottom pants, high-heeled shoes, and glasses. He acted very squirrely and erratic, but it was later revealed that he was playing a character named Reuben Farr, although it looked like Letterman wasn't in on the joke. This appearance would further cement Glover's odd on-screen persona to the public, for better or worse. He would later reprise this character in the indie film Reuben and Ed. It's about a real estate salesman named Ed who winds up on a road trip with Reuben Farr, a reclusive loner on a mission to bury his frozen cat. I watched this recently and it's weird. Not sure I liked it, not sure I hated it, but I do feel like I uncovered something unique in the filmography of Crispin Glover. So, bonus points there. Mr. Farr would once again make an appearance in the music video for Crispin's song Clowny Clown Clown. He has a production company called Volcanic Eruptions, which he's published books and made movies under. In 2007, 18 years after Back to the Future Part 2, there would be a burying of the hatchet between Crispin Glover and Robert Zemeckis. When Zemeckis was mounting up his fully motion capture film, Beowulf, he decided to bring Crispin on board to play the part of Grendel. When you watch the behind-the-scenes footage of both artists, you can see a professional and harmonious working relationship between them. Gone is the tug-of-war on how to simply stay in frame. Of course, it didn't hurt that the frame was not as much of an issue since they were motion capturing this time around. But what I'm saying is that they were able to put aside their past and create something new together. I gotta admit, it felt like hot chicken soup seeing them back together after all these years. Glover himself said he respects Zemeckis and he enjoyed working with him again. It actually speaks volumes about both of them that they were able to move forward like that. And the thing about Crispin is he's been working non-stop since his abrupt departure from the Back to the Future franchise. He has a reputation, but it's not all bad. Most recently, he's been working on American Gods, in which he played Mr. World for 19 episodes. He also stars in an episode of Guillermo del Toro's upcoming series, Cabinet of Curiosities. I'm happy for the guy. You know, it's ironic that he had a problem with the message of Back to the Future Part 1. To me, the movies were always about the future not being written yet, so make it a good one. Well, Crispin has been writing his future his way, and you know what? I think he has something to be proud of. If you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything.